Draft science video on the subject of inertia, a model of inertia theory and such for the message board, forum, whatever. Just to isolate subjects. So the subject is basically momentum. Already got 13 minutes into this video and the camera froze, so just trying a new camera. Anyway, kind of an act of God or something, right? Or the devil. Or whatever, the elephant fairies, something's messing with me. That's what people will do. They'll yeah, paranoid people will say the force is against me, the force of sending me a message. Anyway, so yes, it's all about force and all that stuff, so I wasted a bunch of good little drawings and such, so maybe we'll use some of the same ones. Alright, so momentum, the idea of stuff moving. Stuff, you move it and it keeps on moving. And so regular physics doesn't really provide much of an explanation beyond, hey, it's moving and it's going to keep doing that until something stops it. Where I would argue that it's moving because something's different about it. This pen not moving and the pen moving are two different pens. There's stuff that changes inside the pen, actually. Force goes into it, and it captures it in a way that tends to keep everything moving, all the little bits. Alright, so I'm arguing for a field theory, essentially the quantum field of little bits moving the speed of light. The argument that these little bits that make up photons and all the other forces move the speed of light, and their momentum we don't have an explanation for. They just do it. They do one thing. They have only one-dimensional matter in the sense that they have no mass in any other dimension except the dimension they're moving in, and they have this one quanta of force effect. So it's the most basic elemental piece of energy is one of these little tons moving the speed of light, and it impacts something. It has 1 ton of effect. And the only thing that's different about light is that it's at a specific frequency, and magnetism is polarization. There's 2 kinds of these things, and blah blah blah. So see other videos for explanations of that kind of stuff. So the idea is that there's something fundamentally different, and because it's matter, we can sort of know that it's fundamentally different. We can just imagine that matter, no matter whether you believe the standard model or my more elaborate, much less elaborate, simpler model of a mechanical system. Either way, you're stuck with this idea of protons, electrons, neutrons, these different material particles or entities that have to, when something moves, they somehow also have to carry this momentum thing. They also have to acquire some will to go. And I would argue that their will is decided by the forces around them. Electrons fly off of surfaces perpendicular in energetic circumstances, or magnetic, let's say, and they move based on field energy that dictates basically their path. They don't decide where to go, they are forced to go based on how much stuff is in the field, how much stuff is pushing, how balanced the field is. If it's perfectly balanced, they go nowhere. If there's any imbalance, then they go the direction indicated by the imbalance. So there's always a pressure that is deciding where it goes. So it's forced, it's pushed. And inside the atom, the same effects are happening. Nothing in the atom is freely floating around in some sort of nothing's bothering me place. The very nature of the fact that the atoms have come together means there was a force pushing them together, and a lack of pressure in between them that allowed them to get close. And once they're close, they become more and more rigid. So the closer they're pushed together, the more rigid their positions become in terms of balancing all the forces. Alright, that's a general argument that's probably okay. So the idea is that some little bit in the field hits something, and basically its momentum, the quanta speed, moving the speed of light, one little bit moving the speed of light. It's essentially spread over all this stuff in the matter, and it creates a little tiny velocity that's basically proportional to the number of bits. So if the matter was just 1 bit, well, then it would move the speed of light when it left. But if the matter is 1,000,000 bits, then it's going to be moving 1/1,000,000th the speed of light, because that movement has to be spread over every single bit, and to continue moving it has to keep spreading it. It has to keep pushing the little bits along, because they won't move on their own. So the theory is that electrons and protons don't really have any rest mass. That means they don't have any, they're not affected by gravity. And you can get some indication of that in the sense that the old-fashioned TV screens, the CRTs, the cathode ray tubes, you could turn them upside down and the image wasn't messed up in any way. So clearly gravity wasn't doing anything, because you could turn them any way in the gravity, and there was zero effect on how well the electrons flew to their location inside the tube. And you can also get it from the fact that there doesn't appear to be any category for radiation coming from space that's made of protons. They're hard to throw, and when you throw them, they can only go a certain distance before they lose their velocity and are driven by the existing field in the area. So they don't get any of that perpetual motion thing. They don't get the shoot them and they just keep going. They just don't do the keep going thing. And so there has to be a mechanism inside of matter that allows for this collection of force. And the collection, I'm arguing, is because of the mechanism between these forces, in the sense that the protons and the electrons have different polarization, and when force of the opposite polarization hits them, the reflexive reaction is to release something in one of the perpendicular directions. So if it's moving this way, something leaves going this way when it gets hit, this from the bottom or the top. It's a perpendicular release of the exchange. It's a perpendicular exchange when the polarizations are opposite, when the energy is the opposite polarization to the electron or the proton. And that creates this idea of the right or left turn, which, you have a few of those and you end up with a circle. You end up back where you started. And it's that mechanism that allows for capturing force. And that's essentially what stuff does when it has velocity. It's a kind of capture. It's like a battery storing energy, but the difference being that the energy is just stored in an imbalance in the motion of the elemental bits inside of the material. So I would illustrate it maybe by this idea of just a circle that just never starts at the same place, and so the circle is just off, and so it just keeps going more this way than it goes this way. That can be illustrated a lot of different ways, and I did point out in the previous video that if you start at one location, you can get there, you can make your square or your circle in lots of eccentric ways where you would end up back at the same starting point. And the point is that the difference is that you end up, when you capture force, you end up expending more pathway in one direction than you expend in the other direction. And so then you end up with a finishing point that's ahead of your starting point, and then you start the whole thing again and do your circle in this eccentric way of random turns, and you'll end up in the same place. And as I pointed out, the density of matter is very thick with these little bits, and so you can imagine that if something was in the middle of an atomic structure, a piece of matter, that it could have very eccentric paths, and it would never get out of this part. It would never take 350,000 right turns and end up at the surface here and then free. So the trap is more certain the more deeper you are into the matter. And that's what's really holding the matter together. So it's almost like a gravity argument. The pressure on the inside is stronger than the pressure on the outside. in terms of the atomic pressure created by the atoms being more and more compressed. But anyway, I don't want to get into something that deep. So the idea is just basically that to have velocity, what you're basically doing is having more mass on one side than you have on the other side. So if we're thinking about it as electrons, and a connection of points that are, say, transferring the energy. So the energy is right turning it here, and then it's right turning here, and then it right turns here, and it right turns at these corners. The difference would be is the stuff going this way, there's no matter in between. So and this side, it's moving, let's say, an electron that's in between these two electrons. So that electron's taking the ride for free, essentially. And so now you have more mass going this way than you have going this way. And therefore, you will move more particles this way than you'll move that way. And in that sense, you'll inevitably end up having something called motion. So when force is imposed on you through acceleration, the process is basically one where all of your matter is getting rearranged, and essentially your mass is getting put in positions that are connected to the force going this way more than they're in positions where the force is going this way. So any force going this way is doesn't have any matter, has fewer bits between it than the force going between two electrons going this way. Anyway, so that would just inevitably lead to the spreading of this quanta of energy. The spread would be that it hits more stuff, this way than this way. So that is the basic theme of what's causing the maintenance of the velocity, is the trapping of the force. So the force goes in and it stays in. So I could argue that with a battery or something, the storage of potential has more to do with distances, where two electrons are forced closer together, and therefore the energy between them, how many hits are happening, this pressure, the stuff bouncing back and forth between them, the quanta that are trapped between them. So there's other videos on that subject, because that's basically the forces. As I pointed out, the bits that hit something that are a different polarization leave at a 90-degree angle. The bits that are the same polarization reflect. So when two electrons are near each other, there's bits bouncing between them that are of the same polarization, and they can never leave. They just keep bouncing back and forth. And so you can understand, the closer I bring them together, the more often they'll hit the two electrons, and it's getting hit that is energy. And so it makes it more energetic just because they're bouncing back and forth faster. And that would be like the storage of energy for like a battery or something. So this storage of velocity is a little bit different, because it really doesn't have to do with necessarily overtly with compression, but it just has to do with the fact that adding more electrons is the same thing as adding more compression, in a sense. And the effect is that you get this thing that looks like energy, which is motion. So the other thing to understand I didn't get to was the idea of the dimensionality of matter, and the fact that the photon is just a one-dimensional object, and that regular matter has motion in all three dimensions, in the sense that there's bits moving, forward, back, left, right, in and out here, however you want to describe, however you want to visualize it. So there's energy moving in all directions, leaving like a light bulb. It doesn't, there's pressure, and there's external pressure that's equalized that pressure, and so you end up being a container of energy moving out, and it gets reflected back in, essentially. But that's what you are. And so when it reflects off this side, then it goes out the back side, and then it gets reflected back this way, and it comes out the... But that's the force idea, the fact that we have a skin or a shield or pressure. That pressure is being created by these bits that are coming out in all different ways. Where something like a photon, like I said, has only momentum. It only has mass in one dimension, where it's going, and it's completely invisible on the perpendicular planes. It doesn't have anything. And the rest of it's just a conversion process. And I forget whether I did it in this video, but the whole moon argument, I think I did it already, right? That you can go into the moon and you can exchange the values, into gravity. And what you're really doing is you're going in with too much energy this way, and you're going to get back this energy, so you're going to just reverse your direction. And you can do that essentially for free. It's a free conversion in the sense that there's no obvious energy involved. And really all that's really going to happen is you're going to exchange this direction. The moon is going to go a little tiny bit this way because of its huge mass. It only has to go a little tiny bit this way. And it's going to give you this direction in return. So you're going to make the exchange with the moon. And so that's what any three-dimensional object is doing, is that any imbalance in force in any direction, it will just rebalance that imbalance, in the sense that it'll give away what's imbalanced. Too much coming this way, it'll give away some of that and go the other way. So everything's just reacting to field balance. Everything's not trying to get it, but everything is forced to tend towards balance in all the interactions it has with anything. And through that process of those exchanges is what's converting everything. And the imbalance is essentially being caused because of this conflict between protons and electrons, in the sense that the energy is converted into different directions, and so that breaks balance. So if things are going back and forth between two electrons and a proton slides in, the proton will take all that energy and move it out into perpendicular dimensions and essentially eliminate all the pressure between the electrons. And now the electrons can move incredibly close to each other because the proton is getting rid of all the energy that was forcing the electrons to stay apart. It's getting rid of all the reflections. So if you're imagining electrons on two sides of a proton, the force between the electrons doesn't exist when they're opposite each other, and the protons in between, because the proton's leaking all of that energy out. Most of it. Sorry, I don't want to say all, because that's not actually correct, but most of it is leaking out, and so the electrons get much closer. And then when the electrons move some other away from, let's say, the proton, are not perfectly angularly, if they have some other angular position from the center of gravity, then they'll have to move apart from each other because the force will behave as normal, and the added extra reflections will cause them to move apart. So depending on position is everything in these atomic models. And I fundamentally don't believe that this model is going to work very well with a bunch of elemental bits moving incredibly fast and sharing electrons in the traditional sense. I think when an electron is shared, it is literally shared, in the sense that two atoms that are jiggling, everything's jiggling because of the extra heat and other kinds of forms of energy that are in the system, all the changes in momentum and direction that are constantly being readjusted. Everything's being readjusted by its environment all the time. even though we seem stationary, we are being accelerated by the gravity of the Earth, and we're being accelerated by the gravity of the Sun, and we're being accelerated by the gravity of the Moon. We're constantly in an accelerating frame, in essence, and everything's getting moved not by the second, but by the Planck measure of time, which is probably 1,000,000,000,000 times shorter than a second. So you have to understand that all this is happening much faster than your perception rate. The real universe, lives 1,000,000 years of intricate action in the 1 second of your perception. There's a whole bunch of activity taking place in that little tiny bit of time. But that's what's balancing you, is a lot of actions that are taking place not in a second, but in millionths of a second, billionths of a second. I did want to say something there, and I lost what I drew the little bit. So the atoms are locked more or less. So I would argue that if these were protons of atoms and they were sharing an electron, they're literally sharing it. These are locked positions, and they move, they vibrate, they might shift, they might do something, but there's no, this isn't going half the speed of light around both these things and doing the figure 8 thing. I don't think any of that's happening. So I don't think magnetism or anything else would work right if it was. And I don't think it just obeys the laws of magnetic effects. Magnets are very good at, if you move stuff around too much with magnets, you can't keep their position. It breaks down. But if you keep them steady enough, you can create magnets where you have one magnet with its polarization north here, and then you put the other magnets around it, and you can create a circumstance where these magnets are attracted to each other, but these magnets are repelled by each other. And the force required to push this one closer to this one ends up being stronger than the force pulling it towards this one. And so they'll essentially all end up just locked in these positions. And you could theoretically, if there was no imperfections in your system, it was perfectly frictionless, you could theoretically push one of these magnets and they'd all just spin in around this central hub in a frictionless manner for theoretically ever. But yeah, we can't do it to that precision, but on the subatomic level, that kind of precision is possible. And I think that's what's really locks things together, is that there isn't as much, there's movement, but it's all the random kind of movements, not deliberate movements. Beyond the fact that obviously there has to be movements of the force through things that are moving, in the sense that more force going one way than force going the other way, and the thing moves. And then when it hits a new force, more force coming from this direction, then it can get rid of that force and exchange it, and the other body gets it. But force is transferred, and so when something's moving, it's moving because something transferred actual force into it. It made an exchange that changed the composition of the thing. The percentages of what the thing has in it changed. Okay, so that's probably enough for this video. So more to come, better video to come, all that kind of stuff. I'll think about better ways of explaining, but for now I think that's good enough. I did this, right? The fact is, so what I'm saying is this motion, this uneven circle that just keeps going a little bit forward, the idea would be is that you have an extra bit of matter in the stream going this way than in the stream going this way. And the more matter you shove in the stream going this way than this way, the more velocity the object will end up appearing to have. Okay, that's probably enough now. So, till next time and such.